This meeting is being recorded.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Davina Lines. I'm the Managing Director at the Ecommerce Club. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is a professional development webinar which has been brought to you by the Fashion Network and the Ecommerce Club. We're both networks that operate in the e-commerce and fashion retailing space, and we do regular events, regular webinars. Today's session is about headless e-commerce. It's a masterclass, and we're going to be covering a number of different areas. Obviously, starting off with, exactly what headless e-commerce is, that kind of decoupling of the front end and the back end, but looking at sort of where that fits into the e-commerce landscape, different types of e-commerce platforms that are available, and then a bit more of a deep dive into headless e-commerce so that we can understand sort of, where that can benefit an e-commerce business, and also sort of what some of the sort of intricacies are of integrating that and of making sure you've got that sort of functioning to the best of its ability. So if you've got any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the chat box. We want everyone to take part, and we want some interactivity. We also want to take some questions for you. So please do sort of put sort of questions in there, and also potentially towards the end maybe raise your hand, and then we can actually bring you live onto the webinar as well. So please get as involved as possible. We're going to record this, so it's going to be available on YouTube. So if you've got colleagues or you want to check in on some information, it will be available on YouTube, and we'll put that out on both the Ecommerce Club and the Fashion Network so that you can actually sort of check into that, and also we'll do a follow-up email, a thank you email with that link in too. After this session, we're also going to do a much more informal sort of virtual networking 20 minutes where you'll actually be able to interact with us and with the panelists, and you've got questions or anything sort of specific that you want to raise. That's a really good opportunity to be able to do that, and even share information with sort of other colleagues that are on the call too. So please do look out for that link. That's going to be dropped in towards the end, and as I say, that's a kind of sort of free for all. You can just come in and join in. We'd also be quite keen for you to be putting in information about who you are, where you're from in the world. I know we'll have lots of people from the UK, but we have many listeners that will tune in from around the world. And if we could then understand a little bit about your job role, your company, this would be a really good opportunity for us to be able to understand who's on the call and sort of what your function is within that business. We'd also, it's an open sort of webinar. So if you are a student and you're studying, or you're an intern, again, please, join in. Feel free to say sort of what you're studying, sort of what your involvement is, and then we can then sort of at least sort of tune into who's on the call. So without much further ado, as I say, I'm Davina Lines. I'm the co-founder and managing director of the Ecommerce Club, and I'm going to look after today's event. BetterCommerce, who are our partner for today, they offer headless and composable solutions to mid-market retailers. In particular, they're offering the following solutions. They've got PIM, e-commerce, Experience, OMS, Engage, AI and personalization engine and analytics tool. So I'm going to hand over to them shortly, and they'll be able to tell you sort of a little bit more about sort of what they can offer, and where they kind of fit into the picture. And obviously that brings expertise to this discussion. So, please let's give them a big thank you for actually helping us with today's learning event. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Finlay Mure from BetterCommerce. So Finlay, if you can take over from me.
Yes, hi everyone, very nice to be here. As Davina said, I'm VP of Sales and Marketing for BetterCommerce, and we offer headless and composable solutions to retailers. I guess what I'd like to do, to set the scene for today's discussion is talk a little bit about where we've been and where we are today. So I guess when e-commerce first started, it was a very, clunky, very difficult thing to do. All of the content, all of the business logic and the presentation layer was grouped together, and it became very difficult to or very challenging to build solutions, and maintenance and upgrades of them were quite difficult. And then around about sort of 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, commerce became more industrialized, and we had the growth of platforms. And I think that was really where we started to see the rise of what's called service-orientated architecture, where we started to become a bit more sensible in terms of how we manage web content and business logic through reusable APIs. And then fast forward to today, where we have the abundance of web applications, marketplaces, and mobile devices. This really has accelerated the momentum behind decoupling the front end and the back end, which is headless commerce. So I'm looking forward to getting more into detail, and that's a quick introduction for me.
Perfect. And Camilla is also joining us on the panel. Can you just give us a little bit of background about who you are, your experience, Oliver Bonas, just so we can understand sort of where you fit into the puzzle?
Yes, hi everyone. Great to be here. I'm Camilla. I work at Oliver Bonas, have done for probably rather too many years, coming up for 11 or 12. I'm Connected Commerce League, which sort of covers a lot of areas, but and I've worked over the years in many areas of e-commerce, from content, marketplaces, helping build out our international sites, digital marketing, paid search, and so on. So I suppose you could almost call me jack of all trades. But what I have done is been through 3 re-platforms. It's funny that Finlay mentioned 20 years, because it's about 20 years ago that we started trading online. It was before my time, but it was the very early days. You had Ollie and Tim, the owners, running around packing and picking themselves, and because we had so few orders. But fast forward to about 8 years ago, where we, in one of our re-platforms, we shifted from a bespoke website to a headless website. So we were pretty early adopters of that sort of technology, but I'll go into that later.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed. So I think we wanted to get a bit of an idea as to the knowledge levels of the audience. So we're going to put up a poll now. So do you know how headless can benefit yourselves as retailers in improving conversion rates and reducing TCO, so total cost of ownership? So do you know how headless can benefit you as a retailer? Yes or no would be perfect. And then I'm just going to give a shout out to a few people, actually, because it's interesting to see sort of like who's joined us whilst you're all filling this in. And I saw Copenhagen come up when I was having a look. I also could see people couldn't hear me at the beginning. I do apologise about that if it took a minute for us to kind of feed through. We've got Rochester, London, Exeter, people from Selfridges, Body Shop, Apricot Clothing, Minto, Red Mills in Kilkenny Island, Arsenal Football Club as well, I can see there. So thank you everyone for joining us. Right, so we've got the results back from that. So it looks like there, most people don't actually know how it can benefit retailers, improving conversion rates and the total cost of ownership. So so that's actually really quite useful sort of like kickoff, I think, as we sort of go into this this first section. Finlay, I think this is very much sort of more your remit. What we wanted to get an understanding of is the e-commerce landscape to date, where we are now and where we really see the sort of future of sort of e-commerce and e-commerce platforms, I suppose, sort of planning into that, different types of platforms that are available. So I don't know if you want to just give us a kind of a setting the scene type section.
So just to reiterate, I guess, what I said at the beginning, to my point, when e-commerce first launched, it was, there was one website to deal with, right? There was one channel, let's say, that you had to communicate with, and there was one system to manage. So you had all your content, all of your presentation, all of your business logic was there. But if you fast forward to today, you've got hundreds of different types of customer-facing touch points. You have marketplaces, websites, applications, smart devices, and so on. So the abundance and the growth of customer-facing touch points has increased tenfold. So therefore, the old legacy systems of hard-coded, hard dependencies between front and back end no longer is fit for purpose. I mentioned service-oriented architecture. It has been around for a long time. It was really only accessible to the large retailers and enterprises, but it's becoming much more accessible for mid to enterprise retailers. You know, if you're really wanting to consider improving your customer experience, thinking about personalizing the experience across multiple touch points, multiple applications, you have to think about decoupling the front end and the back end. It creates a lot more flexibility and a lot more agility within your tech stack and within your organization. Not to mention a couple of benefits. It will help you separate your teams as well. Today, too often I see high dependencies between teams. If things want to be changed, it's very difficult and very, very slow to do so. But one of the benefits, I'd say, of a headless approach or headless architecture is not only the technical aspect of separating the front end and the back end, you also enable your teams. You empower your teams to be able to act quicker and deliver features and functionality much smoother.
Perfect. And was there a slide or something that you wanted to pull up at this stage that?
No, I think I was going to present in terms of the number of different marketplaces and things that we have integrated with, but I'd leave that for anyone who'd like to pick up the conversation with me afterwards. You know, happy to go into that in more detail. Yeah,
perfect. Okay. So Camilla, I want to bring you into the discussion now because you're a long-standing proponent of headless e-commerce, probably one of the sort of, earliest adopters that I know of in the marketplace. But you said there's, obviously some benefits, be useful to understand what the reasoning was behind that. But also you said potentially there are some issues with that still with keeping the marketplace. So could you give us a kind of overview as to sort of why the decision was made in the first place, how long you've been doing headless and what your kind of understanding is of the benefits and sort of how that best works?
Okay, yeah, sure. So as I say, about 8 or 9 years ago, we actually were using a bespoke website. And in fact, looking back on it, the functionality was incredibly sophisticated for the time and really, really good. But as you can imagine, because it was bespoke, any form of integration was just tortuous. And even, changing the templates for the homepage became this sort of long, drawn out piece of work. And it just became untenable. So we did the sort of searching around, the due diligence, and we talked to all the big providers. But we felt that the monolithic approach, which was sort of prolific, well, most people were using at that time, was really too restrictive for us. You were stuck into their development cycles. And unless you were a big enterprise company, your requests for sort of, software changes or things were not really considered important enough to affect. So we wanted a bit more flexibility, a bit more freedom, and not be stuck in with the roadmap of the big enterprise companies. So we looked around and we found the web agency that we're still with, actually, and they had decided that the same restrictions of the monolithic approach were not for them. So what they did, which was quite difficult at the time, was to build their own front end that was separated from the back end. So now, for all those people out there, there are a lot of off-the-shelf front ends, so you can much more easily create a headless site by having your own back end and then having a sort of ready-made front end. But when we were starting out, they didn't really exist. So our web agency built their own front end, which we still use. It's called Core 4, and they use it on all their websites now. So ours is quite simple. We have a Magento backend and this Core 4 front end. And we also have a headless CMS, which has also been built by our web agency. So it's sort of what you might call sort of intermediate stage of headless. As Finlay said, there's a separation of the front end and the back end, but we are yet to be sort of in the composable mode, which is where I'll let Finlay go on to explain that. But sort of, there is the simple front end and back end with the API connection. And we have, people might have heard the term microservices. So we have a couple of microservices which are connected via API, but we haven't fully broken out into a modular form for our back end. I don't know if that's enough, but perhaps I'll let Finlay take over with the to explain where Composable will take over from Headless, really.
So many buzzwords these days, isn't there?
Yeah.
And I don't think they're going away anytime quickly either. But no, just to reiterate Camilla's point, of course, there's many different frameworks and ways in which you can design your front end. You know, you've got single page applications, progressive web apps, React-based storefronts, and so on. And each of them has has different pros and cons, and there's an audit or an evaluation that you have to do as a retailer to find out what strategy is best for you. In terms of BetterCommerce and how we would position ourselves, is that your front end is your front end. You pick and choose how you want to design it, how you want to architect it together, and so forth. And we do have a module. We have a React-based storefront or e-commerce module that our clients can use, have used, and will use going forward. But we don't hold them to that. It's not a requirement to use our storefront application. So if decisions have already been made there, we recognize the importance around the storefront and the design and things, and that wants to stay the same. And to Camilla's point, from behind the scenes, we have what's called a composable approach. And effectively what that is, it's a bunch of modules and applications that are critical to any retailer. And we've separated them out. So to mention a few of them now, one of them is called our PIM. So our product information management module is clearly, it's there to help you manage your product catalog, your price lists, and help you scale internationally. It's got inherently built multilingual, multi-currency aspects and rules, pricing rules engine, and so forth. But that's a separate composable module that we would offer to our retailers from the back end. We also have an order management system as well, which again can be stitched together to complete a platform or can be used independently. So just to summarize, I guess the composable element is best of breed. So you can pick and choose whatever you need as a retailer to help you achieve your goals and aspirations of where you want to get to.
On that, Finlay, I was going to ask, we sort of discussed it before, what is the sort of minimum you need to run an e-commerce site of those composable, those modular elements?
Yeah, no, good question. So clearly it would be your store, your e-commerce module. You would need to have that to build your store and your checkout and so forth. A PIM would be an essential requirement. That's, as I said, being able to manage your catalog, centralize your product catalog across all of those hundreds or if not thousands of different customer facing touch points. And your OMS, being able to receive orders, process those orders, communicate with the customer, manage your returns and so forth. So I would say those three are the fundamental key pillars: e-commerce, PIM, and OMS.
And your front end, very important, Camilla. Yeah. And is Headless for everyone? I mean, should everyone be going in this direction, or is it actually sort of more suited to certain types of
so you mean as Headless? You mean Headless as a concept? Yeah. So
as a concept, yeah.
So I think Headless has actually been around for a very long time, just under a different disguise. So as I said at the beginning, service-oriented design was born when we started to get a bit smarter about how we build e-commerce sites, which effectively is the separation of your front end and back end. So shared components through reusable APIs, and that's been happening for some time, but as I say, only being accessible to a few. So the reason that this has really accelerated recently is due to the explosion of customer-facing touch points. The number of consumers who are shopping on multiple different devices, as we know, marketplaces, each marketplace having its own rules and regulations in terms of how you list products there, in terms of attributes and pictures and images. So this explosion of customer-facing touch points, this explosion of customer expectations and demands, we're all becoming a bit more fickle, I guess, in terms of what we expect. Our expectations have increased. And this is effectively for us, well, my position would be in terms of being able to satisfy and serve all of those unique circumstances. You need to have a very flexible and very agile tech stack. And hence why we believe, headless commerce, which is the separation of front end and back end through an API layer, is the way to do that. And the composable approach just means that you can pick and choose what you need from a back-end perspective to make it run well and help you scale. So I truly believe that in order to survive and grow and scale going forward, you need to think about this headless architecture and the benefits that it will bring. And I believe that this is the future of commerce.
Yeah, I agree, Davina. I think it's inevitable that this is the way websites are going to go. Though my only caveat is that perhaps if you're a startup or a small business, you probably will benefit from a monolithic approach, from getting a Shopify Plus, just because if you are literally bootstrapping a business, you've got limited funds and limited ability to, developers and so on and so forth. The simplicity of an all-in-one is probably the best way to start. But what's happening now is that these, all these, Shopify, Magento, Salesforce, they're all preparing or building their sites now for headless. So you can, start on Shopify and then change to Shopify headless and attach, connect with APIs, one of these sort of ready-made front ends. So I think you could do it as a progressive sort of process if you're a startup business. I mean, if you're an enterprise business, well, I think there's no question you should be headless, and you should probably be going through the heavily sort of composable microservices approach. But it needs to be planned in, and you do need to consider the development requirements. It does add elements of complexity because you have got a lot of potentially, if you've got a lot of touch points, you're going to have a lot of APIs, a lot of different components. Having said that, the benefit of that is that developers can work on that without it impacting anything else. So, you can have what happened with us, for instance. So we had our headless, we had our front end, our back end, and we had to make the choice of moving from Magento 1 to Magento 2, or completely re-platforming to a whole different setup. But in the end, it made sense to move from Magento 1 to Magento 2 because the front end could stay the same. Because we were decoupled, all we had to do was replace the back end, made it much simpler. So there are benefits of the headless approach. But also for us, because we're constantly trying to make changes and improvements on our website, but we always have to code freeze at peak. And I don't know if anyone else in listening has to do this. And it becomes very frustrating because you have to get all the work done prior to September, October, and the joy of being separate and having separate composable or modular parts is that you can just code freeze where you need to code freeze, and you can still have developers working on other elements on the front end and so on. So that's one of the major benefits for us.
Yeah, just to reiterate one of those points, I think there's, as Camilla said, for retailers who are just starting out, initial, retailers who want to start a business tomorrow, of course, there are options there. Shopify clearly is the right path to go in terms of just getting started. But as businesses start to scale, you start to encounter problems and challenges when it comes to customer data, warehousing, international expansion. All these things create new challenges, and that's kind of where BetterCommerce would position ourselves. It's where you're a scaling business, you're looking to the future, you're trying to think of how to get 5-10 years ahead. How do I set myself up for growth? And to Camilla's point, a headless architecture is certainly the right way to go, because you're thinking about how can I enable my back-end teams to work independently and enable my front-end customer experience teams to do what they need to do. Headless architecture allows you to do that, and it's certainly it's certainly not for a retailer starting today, but certainly as you're starting to scale and think about growth, it's time to consider a new approach.
And do we know where? I was going to say, do we know where that tipping point is? I mean, I was talking to a lady just recently, in fact, who we both met, Camilla, Natalie Quayle from Smile Teeth, and they're kind of 3 million turnover, and she's starting to hit those issues. Is, you know, when do you then make that step change? When do you make that investment to, you know, to move into a kind of different phase? Those scale up companies, it can be tough to sort of know when that is. Is there any sort of insight as to, you know, if you build to this point on a sort of like a monolithic platform, and then actually when you hit 5 million revenues, that's a really great time, or a certain number of customers, that's a great time to be thinking about moving into headless or composable commerce?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there's a straight answer to it, but I think if I was to give some sort of indication, I think you touched on a number that we often talk about, you know, 5 million to 10 million annual revenue. You're really starting to have some form of challenges based on the initial choices that you made to get started. You know, maybe the platform that you're using, the volume of plugins that you've had to stitch together to create a usable solution, your warehousing capabilities, you need to automate that because it's scaling. You're selling 100 packages a day instead of 5, you know, so you have volume challenges, space, all these things happen around, from our data, I could be wrong, but around 5 to 10 million. So at that point, I would say would be a good marker to start thinking about, well, what are my options? How can I set myself up with uber flexibility that's going to help me scale past, you know, 50 or 100 million in the future?
And there's nobody who shouldn't do it. You know, nobody where you go, actually, do you know what, if you're in this industry, or, you know, you're this type of sort of e-commerce site, I wouldn't worry about your headless.
I guess there's maybe a couple of use cases, but I guess it comes down to resources as well. Like, I mean, you do need some expertise, you do need some support. Either you need to look externally. I'd say BetterCommerce obviously is a good option for that in terms of how we structure ourselves, which I'll talk about in a bit. In later, but do
you need a kind of contact within the business? So do you need a Camilla or equivalent to be able to deal with who's you know, got that internal knowledge of the retail business and also an internal knowledge of e-commerce and technology in order to be able to sort of work with you? Yes,
yeah, because ultimately it's a shared responsibility. All of our clients, we have a team of people in-house, within the client, there's a technical team that we would work with. We also work with the merchandising team as well, and the digital team. So yes, there is a requirement to have some level of skills and resources internally to work alongside us. So that's a requirement. You know, we touched on microservices. There are companies out there that just focus on pure API microservices approach, and in some cases, I've been speaking to retailers. Their tech team is 50 people. You know, and we would advise against that. We would say that that's a bit too heavy. You're no longer a retailer if you're employing 50 people in your tech team. You've changed your business completely. And going back to the composable approach, another exciting term that's come out from Gartner is PBCs, or packaged business capabilities. And what we've done is, as I said before, we've designed a PIM, we've designed an OMS, we've designed our AI and personalization engine, and you don't have to build that from scratch, right? So our position would be, if you're on a platform like Shopify and you're thinking of moving to headless architecture, we're a good stepping stone, because we're not asking you to build everything from scratch. For example, the Merchant Center to manage all your merchandising is already built. We've built the UI, we've built the admin interface. It's all there. You know, you're not starting from scratch. So to try and answer your question, there is a revenue threshold that we kind of benchmark against, but also the appetite to hire internally or not is another factor that would play into whether you should head down this path or not.
And so, Camilla, from your point of view then, when it comes to the sort of internal resourcing, you've got an agency that you said you're working with, so obviously you're tapping into their expertise. But is this something, can you manage that relationship, or have you got like a whole team of people like around you that help make this work?
We have no developers in-house. We have, it's all done through our web agency. I mean, of course, we have design development team that work with the agency to do all the development work. And we have a technical project manager. I'm just trying to think of our official title. Yeah, so we have, people in-house to communicate between, but we don't have any in-house developers. Not saying that's the right way to go. It might actually be helpful to have in-house developers, but that's the way we manage it.
But that's interesting. Go on. I was going to say that's interesting to understand then. So it doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily need a big internal team. You just need to have the right external assistance.
But that's because our web agency is basically a headless web agency. That is how they build all their sites. So I think if you're moving, you could potentially go, okay, well, we'll have to look for an agency that will do that. Or you have an internal team and work with someone like BetterCommerce who can do quite a lot of that for you, because it is composable and it is just about connecting the pieces together, if you like. And they can guide you on which of the elements you will need to as I call the minimal viable product to run an e-commerce site, or all the extra stuff to make it even better. But I was just going to pick up on, Finlay, something you mentioned about PWAs, because that you threw in another acronym there, because PWAs are sort of unrelated to headless in a way. You can have a PWA on a headless or a monolithic site. It's just something different. So I just thought I'd clarify that. PWAs, I also think, are the next phase, and that we'll all be moving to PWAs, but you don't have to be headless to do that. Just thought I'd mention that. I hope I'm right. It'd be awful if I say this really dogmatically and then I'm wrong. I don't think I am.
No, well, we've got a question that's come in from Haroon, and he said, as you further invest into a composable approach and having integrated with different organisations' service offering, do you expect your technical resource cost to increase considerably compared to a monolith? So do you think can you see that in the chat box, Finlay?
Yeah, I'm just trying to read it again. So I think what he's saying, if you invest in a composable approach, do you expect your technical resource cost to increase considerably? No, is the short answer. I'll reiterate the point around PBCs or packaged business capabilities. So we've done all the hard work. We've basically done all the coding, development, and the piping behind the scenes, if you like, and designed the UI and so on. So in terms of the composable approach, we've done most of the work. There are alternatives to our approach, where you have to build that from scratch, where you have to design the merchant center, you have to design the UI, you have to design the rules, the engine, everything that goes in, and you end up with obviously a highly flexible and extremely bespoke solution. If you follow that path, then yes, you will have to invest heavily or more in your technical resources for sure. But we've done most of the hard work for you. We've packaged these capabilities up, and they are ready to go. So yeah, I would say no from our approach. There are alternatives that you may be aware of, hence the question, and yes, but certainly if you came with BetterCommerce, no, I couldn't see a significant increase in your technical resource costs.
And I think that kind of leads quite nicely into that, where we're kind of covering the sort of, the why, the how much. In terms of cost.
Oh, Davina, I've lost you. Can anyone else hear Davina?
She's frozen.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for Davina to come back, something that we haven't really talked about, oh, she's gone. Something that we haven't really talked about, Finlay, is the reason. Oh, hi, Davina, can you?
Yeah, I'm back, sorry, I think I just dropped out for a second then.
Yeah.
Did you get the end of that question?
No.
I was just asking about the costs. And saying that, just thinking about sort of where this sits against sort of other e-commerce platforms in the marketplace, what are you looking at in terms of headless e-commerce? Do you think it's more expensive, less expensive, equivalent? Does it depend what you do? What are we looking at in terms of how much?
Well, I don't think I can answer that particularly. I mean, I think for us, it was, because we've been with this agency for 8 years, we haven't really looked around. and also some of the monolithic approach is more taking a percentage as well. There are different business models, so it's very hard to judge. I don't know whether Finlay can answer that one.
Yeah, any ideas, Finlay?
So I guess it's there's no straight answer, of course, right? Every business is different. So if I give you just a couple of examples, so some of a recent project that we worked on recently was a retailer who had just migrated from Magento to WooCommerce, and they didn't want to have to redo that again. So, but behind the scenes, they had just opened a new warehouse and they needed a new payment OMS. So that's one scenario, and we priced that up accordingly. Whereas we speak to another retailer who is in a different position, maybe they're B2B, and they want to re-platform their whole tech stack. So therefore, there are different, obviously, commercial conversations to be had there. So it's very hard to give a straight answer in terms of costs, but I wouldn't be put off. I think there's a lot of miscommunication or misinformation, I would say, around Headless, and everyone seems to think it's going to cost an arm and a leg, and therefore people shy away from it. But that's not the case. Without mentioning names, there are other companies in our industry that do require a heavy tech team, that do require a heavy budget to be able to do something. But we, as I say, BetterCommerce, we approach it slightly different. We've pre-packaged our capabilities. We've built a lot of depth within our product already, within our products, I should say, things like subscriptions and memberships and loyalty schemes. That's all natively built within our system. So I wouldn't say that I wouldn't be put off talking to us, at least around costs, but I do recognize that there's a lot of miscommunication out there around Headless, and people just seem to think that it's going to cost a lot of money, which it doesn't. And what
you also have to think, about the cost of not going headless, which is very hard to actually cost up, isn't it? If you don't go headless, what are you missing out on? Exactly. There are a number of things, which is, of course, the speed which we haven't mentioned, speed which comes with Headless, and the flexibility which comes with, well, we've mentioned that a lot, all the different touch points and the ability to work on different elements, modules of your site. But it's ultimately the speed, and that's becoming absolute priority. I don't know if anybody out there is having to deal with their core web vitals at the moment, but it's quite an issue for Google. If you it affects where you're ranking in search engines, but also if you're not passing your core web vitals, it's also not the greatest customer experience. There is a correlation, direct correlation, well, according to various white papers and researchers, that between the speed of your site and your conversion rate. So, if you don't go headless, you will probably be slower, your search rankings will be lower, and your conversion rate will be lower. So these are hard things to put a number on, but they do matter.
And is this then sort of, almost where you see some of these companies that end up, falling over at some point because they don't keep up, because they don't sort of like keep reinventing themselves, and, and you become like a Woolworths or something where you just become sort of, you fall out of the loop?
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the beginning, when commerce first started, everything was grouped together. It was your content, your presentation layer, your business logic was all grouped together. And that is not a scalable solution, especially when you have lots of different customer touch points to adhere to and facilitate and create a good experience. However, we do still see those initial tech stacks and implementations that are present today. And that in itself paints a picture. It is a challenge to unpack that. It is a challenge to go from a monolithic solution to a decoupled headless architecture. And that's why we're here. We're here to help people on that journey. It doesn't have to be a big bang approach. It doesn't need to be one or the other. There are ways to gradually move into a headless environment. So don't be, I guess to your point, yes, there are people who are retailers, I should say, that are still struggling with the old ways of the past, but headless is a way forward, and it doesn't need to be a big bang approach. We could do it step by step, one piece at a time.
Perfect. I think this might be a good time to bring in the other poll, Scarlett. So if we could pop up the poll, we wanted to know, is people actually happy with their current e-commerce platform, or is that why they're here, basically, because they're thinking about changing it? So please do take part in this poll. And if you've got any questions at all for the panel, please pop them up. I've lost the previous chat, by the way, so I don't know if any of the panelists have spotted anything that I've missed. But yeah, if you can sort of post up any questions that you have for the panelists, then I can happily pass those on, or of course raise your hand as well, and we can sort of take those questions. So yes, it'd be good to know, how you feel about your current e-commerce platform, and we're just give us a kind of sort of guiding rule. Oh, it looks pretty even actually. So pretty much sort of 50-50. In terms of sort of how people are sort of, currently sort of thinking in terms of their e-commerce platform. Okay, was that what you expected, Finlay, Camilla?
Yeah, well, it depends, because we don't know what the platforms are on, do we? So.
True. So I'm thinking maybe we should have asked. Maybe we should have done a poll on sort of.
Are you headless? Yeah. Are you headless already? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we can understand where they are. So cool. I can see that there's a hand up, but as I say, I can't get to any of the previous messaging because I kind of sort of dropped out of that. So if you did post a question or put your hand up before, if you could just do that again for me, that would be great. Okay, we've got a question there from Imran. What's the best technology for PWAs with Magento? So progressive web app with Magento. Does anyone know the answer to that one? Kind of moving away slightly from.
Yeah, I mean, this is slightly moving on, but Magento have a thing called PWA Studio, so that you can build your own within the Magento system. So I think if you just Google PWA Studio Magento, you'll find that out. In terms of, we were talking about the speed, and for those who are interested, they may not be, but Finlay mentioned single page apps, which is how the most headless front ends are built. They're built with either Angular, React, or Vue sort of technology frameworks, and they work by the pages are rendered on the browser side rather than the server side, and that's a much more rapid process. So they're much faster. So I don't know if anyone's interested, but that's one element. And the other advantage of that, because the pages are rendered on the browser side, that makes scaling better. So because the computing power comes from the browser side rather than the server. So if you suddenly have a big spike, you have a sale of some amazing product, and suddenly you have hundreds of thousands of extra people on your site, it's less likely to impact because the computing power is on the browser side of the users rather than on the server side. So there are sort of other little advantages of, well, they're not quite little, they're quite big advantages of headless being built using single page apps.
No, perfect. So we have a question actually from someone who's tuned in at the moment. So Miroslav, I believe, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but wants to sort of pop on and ask a question. So I don't know whether you could. Oh, hello, welcome.
Yeah, hello. So I'm from Sofia. I am CSO at Zotra company. We're part of, let's say, a big team of Salesforce Commerce Cloud developers. And my question is, I think Camilla was the right person to answer me, but the rest can also join. How do you choose the external teams or agency to do the job? Because we're mostly doing subcontracting for big agencies. So what basically brands do, they hire an agency hire us. So how do you choose, how do you evaluate the teams to do the external work? Thank you.
Well, because ours is, well, for a start, ours is Magento, so that's slightly different from yours. But because we work with our web agency, it's they who choose the external teams. Do you mean I'm not sure if you mean for other vendors providing other services such as search or reviews or that sort of thing, or whether you're talking about actual people doing the development work. I'm not sure which you're referring to. But if it's developers, we rely on our web agency to hire and select the right people. If it's third-party providers, we often work with our agency. So either we will search and then get a sort of, a second opinion from them. So when we were looking for a company to do our search or our reviews and that sort of thing, or our CDP, we will work together with them. But I'm not sure I've answered your question.
I don't know, Finlay, did you have any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the question was around, so how would a retailer such as Oliver Bonas choose an agency per se, you know, and obviously then that agency would then subcontract work to his business. So he's trying to get an idea of, you know, what are retailers looking for in agents as such, you know, so things like, I guess, size, resources, how many people are there, you know, in terms of what's their case studies, what's their experience, you know, have they worked in your industry before, are they familiar with your nuances within, if you're in fashion or cosmetics or you're in furniture. So I guess if I was a retailer and I was choosing an agency, I'd be looking at those things. I'd be looking at their experience, their case studies, their skill sets, and also just getting an idea from the founders and the directors of where they're going. You know, what do they want to do with the agency in the next 4 or 5 years? You know, what's their vision? What's their passion? What's their purpose? We were just at IRX, Camilla and I, last week, and I think one of the big themes that came out of that, which is an event in the UK where all brands, retailers and agencies come together, and it was always, every talk I went to was about purpose. There has to be a purpose. So I think this is becoming not just in, you know, consumer world where people buy products. I think that's going to feed through into the B2B space as well.
I think one of the things
Sorry, just one thing to pick up on that. Sorry, yes, so you did answer that much better than me, Finlay, actually. I'm the retailer. But one thing that we look at is an agency that will work with you, won't just build your site and sort of move on, but they will stay with you and build a relationship with you. And as I say, work together with you when you are looking at alternative things. So it's a lot of it is about the relationship with the founders and what their values are and their way of working with the retailer.
And then for you, I assume that then, you know, becomes an extension of your team in effect. That means you don't have to have that big internal team because you've outsourced that, but they're with you for a number of years, as you said, with your current agency. I wanted to now kind of sort of just move on to the marketplaces, Finlay, because marketplaces, you know, obviously a major outlet for many sort of retailers in terms of sort of selling their product and additional kind of marketing opportunity for them. There are so many marketplaces out there. You know, how do you see sort of marketplaces fitting into the picture?
Yeah, it's funny. Not a day goes by, I think, where this topic comes up, and you know, you're absolutely right. It's a growing trend, and I think it's here to stay. It is difficult. I mean, I'm currently working on a project just now with a retailer in India, and I'm getting familiar with local marketplaces there. Obviously, the common ones, the Amazons and Etsy's and eBay's are there, but there are many that you may or may not know about. And every single one of them has a different way in which you have to operate in terms of how they map attributes, how they manage image sizing, you know, so many different nuances. And the challenge there is trying to manage that as a retailer. You know, how do you do that? And I think Camilla will maybe share some of the systems that she's brought on to do that. But from our position, you know, we map this out and we develop it within our system so that each marketplace is mapped accordingly. You know, we always try to reduce the reliance on third-party plugins or different tools, because we believe inherently that that's actually adding more complexity to your tech stack. So we recognize the growth of marketplaces, we recognize the challenges with marketplaces, and we are dealing with that accordingly. And, you know, happily speak to anyone after this offline about how we would do that. But yes, hopefully that's answered your question, but I see you left for a second, but now you're back.
No, I'm back. I was just standing up.
Yes.
So,
Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it you know, marketplaces become a kind of necessary evil, I suppose, or maybe they're not evil, but, you know, a necessary sort of part of the mix, haven't they? And that kind of integration is important. Camilla, are you involved with any of the marketplaces?
Yes. So we a few years ago decided to try and kind of expand internationally via marketplaces rather than trying to build our own sites. Well, we did it two ways. We did 2 international sites with English-speaking countries. So we went to Ireland because that's EU, and then the US because, of course, that's a pretty large market. But for other countries, we decided to go with marketplaces. And as Finlay suggested, that as soon as you start getting beyond, if you're doing a simple, straightforward connection with Amazon or eBay, you can probably manage that relatively simply. But if you start going into multiple marketplaces, and particularly the international ones, the requirements become really complex and really difficult and really unique per marketplace. So for us, we had to go with an outside integrator, and the costs are very expensive, and it's also very complex. So if that's something that can be done through your website as pre-packaged, as Finlay says, then I think that's certainly a better, in terms of cost, that would be an amazing benefit, depending how much yours cost, Finlay, of course, but certainly for us, it was a big expense. Yeah.
And that goes back to one of the earlier questions about costs and the expense of this. And I could say within our PIM, and happy to set up any demonstrations, of course, after this. We'll show you how you can centralize your product catalog. You can design each attribute and map it to each marketplace, and you can easily manage from our PIM which marketplaces you want to sell across. I'll say as simple as ticking a box, but clearly there's a lot of work behind the scenes to do that. But we make it very easy once it's done and set up for the users to be able to sell on marketplaces. So this goes back to the conversation around cost. And here's a good example of how we would approach it through package business capabilities, working with the client, mapping it accordingly, building it within our PIM, or potentially having to go to external agencies, which is very common. It's and there's pros and cons to both, of course, and doing it that way. So it's hard to give an exact price.
And another cost again that we haven't thought about is that if you haven't got what Finlay's offering, one of the costs for us was the time and internal resources preparing for those marketplaces. So to build 3 different feeds, requirement for 3 different marketplaces, getting it all mapped, understanding the requirements, getting the attributes in place, pulling the attributes from our ERP and so on, was an incredibly long, drawn-out process. So if you start to look at those internal costs beyond the third-party integrator, which is yet another cost, I can see that is a huge advantage if you have the PIM and literally the tick box. So we're going to Zalando, we're going to Flickr, whatever they're called. I can't remember the Indian ones that you mentioned, but if you can literally tick a box, then I can see that is an incredible ability.
I think your knowledge is like broader than most, Finlay, isn't it, in terms of the number of sort of marketplaces that are out there, and then even that's not comprehensive.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Mintra is one that comes to mind in India, but yeah, no, it's hundreds, thousands of them, and they're increasing and they're expanding. As people, again, going back to the original point, it's where the customers are. You have to be there, you have to be present, you have to try your best to keep your brand consistent, offer them, sensible information, and trying to do that without having a decoupled front end and back end is going to be incredibly difficult.
I think this kind of brings us into, we're in this last kind of sort of 7 minutes now, so we're going to go after this session into a sort of post networking kind of free-for-all, really, I suppose it is, where you can sort of talk to us, talk to the panelists, and if you've got some questions that you'd like to ask there, or even of other guests that are sort of like involved in that call. So we've dropped in the link. Please do sort of join us on that. But if I was coming sort of like back to you, Finlay, and saying, okay, give me your sort of couple of minutes on why Headless and and the benefits, what would you want people to kind of take away with them?
So I guess my main sort of takeaway is so this service oriented architecture, which is effectively Separating business logic from the presentation layer has been around for some time. It's really only traditionally been accessible to large companies with large budgets, hence where I think the myth comes that it's an expensive business to get into. The acceleration with consumers using multiple mobile devices, marketplaces, as we touched upon, you have to be there, you have to be present. And in order to be able to do that, the best way, in my opinion, is to decouple the front end and the back end. So let your back end teams manage from the back end operations and functions that they have to do, and let the front end teams, in terms of the merchandisers and the digital people who are thinking about promotions and loyalty, let them get on with what they need to do. So so I think headless is the future. I'd like to just finish off by saying as well, it doesn't need to be a big bang approach to re-platform. It can be a step-by-step gradual process to get there. And I'd happily, sit and speak with anyone who's interested about what that might look like for them. Every use case is different, but it's absolutely possible to do this step-by-step.
I think that's probably for me one of the most interesting things, which is, if it is something that you could kind of do in a staged process, and then I'm guessing you can also sort of stage the cost of that as well, then that's not literally just one day switching off, the existing e-commerce website and suddenly going sort of like headless.
In many ways, we'll work with existing tech. So, if someone says, to be on 9 out of 10 calls I have this every week, I should say, is around our PIM, people are thinking, where's a good place to start? And I think a good place to start is centralizing your product information, your catalog, your price list, your suppliers. And we would quite happily integrate our PIM with any tech stack. If you're using Shopify, Magento, WooCommerce, Salesforce, you might not want to touch that for now. The timing, the season, as Camilla said, the timing might not just be right in terms of seasonal peaks and so on. Fine. We could easily help you with your product catalogs and integrate with that tech stack. And in time, you start to transition into more of a headless composable architecture.
Is there any content that you've got that would be useful to share with people sort of after this discussion around that particular topic?
I've got plenty of information around our modules, and I guess I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's information, but if anybody would like to have a chat with me afterwards, obviously happy to do so.
Perfect. And as I say, if you can then share that with the Fashion Network and the Ecommerce Club, then we can distribute some of that too. So Camilla, your couple of minutes on headless e-commerce, the benefits and key takeaways for people.
Oh gosh, well, the speed and the scalability. We do have at peak we do get a vast sort of influx of visitors that we don't have the rest of the year. And Black Friday particularly, and that was really pushed during lockdown, where Oliver Bonas online was 100% of all our sales, and we always managed to cope with that scaling. So I think that's where for us it was advantageous, and the speed, and also now it's specific to us, but we've got this new headless CMS, which is called Inline. So we can actually our design team can actually just look at the page, click on the page from the front end and make the changes to the website directly. That and the separation for the dev teams being able to work separately. It used to be that things would, our Magento or on our bespoke one, one of the back-end developers would work on something and break something on the front end. So then the front end would have to be fixed, and that would break something else somewhere else. So, those are all the main reasons why it's been an advantage for us. Just one thing to note, the checkout is the one thing that we keep from Magento for the front end. Checkout for us, you have to be secure. So that's the one part of Magento we have maintained from the front end, is the checkout.
Okay, so that's interesting. Yeah. So you've hung on to the checkout. Okay.
We've customized it, but we've kept that as part of our of the back end that's in the front end. That's the only bit that we have kept. Otherwise, I think that's probably it, although I'll think of something later, no doubt.
Well, that is perfect timing because we have 1 minute to go. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Camilla, Tress, and also to Finlay, Mure from BetterCommerce and Oliver Bonas. We're obviously going to be joining into this like post-networking session in a moment. I want to say thank you very much to the team at the Fashion Network who are sitting behind the scenes, sort of looking after the chat and the slides and so on. And also sort of thank you obviously to everyone that's listened in today. As we said, we will be distributing a YouTube video of this post-event and also posting out some content on the Fashion Network and the E-Commerce Club. And please join us again in the future for future webinars. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.